He was 15 years old, and he was certain he was about to die. Somewhere in the ruins of northern Germany, in the spring of 1945, a boy stood against a wall with his hands raised. His uniform hung off his shoulders too big, stripped from a dead man. His rifle lay in the mud where he dropped it. In front of him stood the British, the enemy, the monsters. For 6 years, the voice on the radio had told him what these men were. Savages, butchers, they shot every prisoner. They tortured the wounded, they lined up German boys and gunned them down without a word. So he waited for it. The order, the click of the bolt, the last thing he would ever hear. His knees shook. His breath came in short, ragged pulls. He shut his eyes, and nothing happened. Instead, a rough hand pushed something into his fingers. A mug. Hot tea. A voice tired, almost bored, told him to sit down before he fell down. He didn't understand. His mind couldn't hold it. He had been sent here to die. His own leaders had promised him a hero's death. And the enemy? The enemy was handing him a drink. This is the story of the German children who were thrown into the fire of a dying war, who braced for a firing squad, and were given a home instead. And it almost never happened at all. To understand the boy against the wall, you have to understand how he got there. By the winter of 1944, Nazi Germany was dying. Everyone knew it. The Russians were smashing in from the east. The Americans and British were pouring across the west. The great armies of the Reich, the ones that had once swallowed a continent, were gone. Bled white in Russia. Buried in the sands of Africa. Drowned in Normandy. Germany had run out of men. So, it came for the boys. In October 1944, the regime built something called the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. On paper, a national militia. In reality, a last desperate scraping of the barrel. They took the old men, the sick, the lame, and they took children. Boys of 16, 15, some as young as 12, pulled out of classrooms, handed a rifle they could barely lift and a single anti-tank rocket, told to stop the most powerful armies on earth with their bare hands. Most of these boys had spent their whole lives inside the machine. They were born into it. From the age of 10 they had marched in the Hitler Youth. They had been taught that dying for the Führer was the highest honor a boy could earn. They didn't know they were being lied to. How could they? The lie was all they had ever known. By the spring of 1945, these children were everywhere on the front, manning roadblocks, hiding in shattered buildings, firing on tanks the size of houses. And they were dying in droves. Picture one of them, crouched behind a heap of rubble that used to be his street. A Panzerfaust clutched to his chest. One shot, that was all he had. Down the road comes the low, grinding rumble of an enemy tank, 40 tons of steel that doesn't even know he is there. His hands shake so hard he can barely aim. He is a child, and he has been ordered to kill a machine. An entire generation, the youngest one, was being fed into the grinder to buy a few more days for men who were already packing their bags and planning their escape. This was the problem the Allies were about to face. Not hardened soldiers, not fanatics with rows of medals. Children. Terrified. Brainwashed. Heavily armed children. What do you do with an enemy that hasn't even started shaving? The easy answer was revenge. And you have to understand, in 1945, the hunger for revenge was overwhelming. The world was just beginning to see what Germany had done. The camps were being opened. The photographs were coming out. The scale of it was almost impossible to hold in the mind. Soldiers who walked into places like Belsen came out, changed forever, shaking with a rage that had no bottom. Against that, mercy toward any German child or not struck a lot of people as obscene. Shoot them, some said. They chose their side. Let them lie in the grave they dug. But inside the British machine, a small group of people were arguing for something else. Something that, at the time, sounded almost insane. They looked at the captured boys, and they didn't see the enemy. They saw victims. Victims of the most successful brainwashing campaign in human history. Their logic was cold and clear. These children were not born hating. They had been made to hate. 12 years of poison poured into them from the cradle. Every schoolbook, every song, every morning roll call. The Nazis hadn't just built an army. They had rewired a generation's soul. And if that could be done to a child, then maybe it could be undone. This idea didn't come from the top. It came from the edges, from intelligence officers, teachers, and exiles, many of them Germans who had themselves fled Hitler years before. Men who had watched their own country go mad, and were now handed a chance to pull it back from the brink. One of them was a German-born scholar named Heinz Koeppler. He had escaped the Nazis. He had every reason on earth to want them to suffer. Instead, he would go on to lead one of the boldest experiments of the entire war, an effort not to punish young Germans, but to give them their minds back. These were the Mavericks, outnumbered, doubted, fighting against a tide of very understandable hatred. They believed you could not shoot an idea out of a boy's head. You had to replace it. And they were about to try something the world had never seen. The solution was not a weapon. It was kindness. And in 1945, kindness toward the enemy was the most radical thing imaginable. Here is what the British actually did. As hundreds of thousands of German prisoners flooded into Allied hands, and by the end, Britain alone would hold well over 1/3 they were sorted. Not by rank, not by unit, by their minds. Every prisoner was quietly assessed and given a color. White, for those judged free of Nazi belief. Black, for the hardcore fanatics who still worshipped Hitler even in defeat. And gray, for the vast, confused middle, which is exactly where most of the boys landed. The black prisoners were kept apart, watched, but the gray and the white, especially the young ones, were funneled into something extraordinary. They called it re-education. Picture it from the boy's side. He arrives expecting a firing squad. Instead, he is fed. Properly fed, sometimes better than he had eaten in years. He is given a bunk, a doctor, dry clothes, and then, something stranger, he is given books, real books, the kind that had been burned in his own country. He is shown films, not propaganda, but newsreels of the wider world, and, unbearably, footage of the camps his own side had built. He is allowed to argue, to ask questions, to say things out loud that would have gotten him shot a month before. To a boy raised inside a dictatorship, this was almost impossible to process. In his world, the enemy tortured you. The state owned your thoughts. Questions were dangerous. Here, the enemy wanted him to think for himself. Some camps ran lectures, discussion groups, newspapers written for the prisoners, printed in their own language, telling them the things the Reich had spent 12 years hiding. Slowly, deliberately, a door was being held open, and the boys were being invited, not forced to walk through it. Critics back home were furious. This was coddling murderers, they said. A waste of good food on the very people who had tried to burn Britain to the ground. Why treat the enemy's children better than we treat our own? The men running the program held their nerve, because they understood something their critics didn't. You cannot win a war of ideas with a bullet. The boy had been programmed, and the only way to defeat the programming was to show him, every single day, that everything he had been told was a lie. Not with speeches, with tea, with bread, with patience. Now watch what it did to them. Because the real battle wasn't fought on a field. It was fought inside the skull of a 15-year-old boy. For years, his entire reality had rested on two pillars. 1. The Führer is a god. 2. The enemy is a monster. The kindness attacked both at once. At first, the boys didn't trust it. They waited for the trap. The tea was poisoned. Surely the friendliness was a trick to make them talk. Some stayed loyal to Hitler for weeks, even months, snarling defiance from behind the wire, while the man they worshipped lay dead in a bunker. But you cannot hate a man who feeds you every day. It started small. A boy would catch a British guard laughing at a joke, a human, ordinary laugh, and something would crack. This was the savage he'd been warned about? This tired man sharing a cigarette? Then came the films, the footage from the camps. And this was the moment that broke them. Imagine it. You are 17. You gave everything to a cause you were told was noble. You watched friends die for it. And now you are sitting in a quiet room, and on the screen in front of you are the bodies, the pits, the truth of what your side actually did. Some boys wept. Some were sick. Some refused to believe it and screamed that it was faked, because to accept it was to accept that their whole lives had been built on a monstrous lie. For some, the wall came down in a single afternoon. For others, it took years of slow erosion, one small kindness at a time, until one day they woke up and found the hate simply wasn't there anymore. That is the real terror of this story. Not the fear of death. The collapse of everything you ever believed. The rumors moved through the camps, bunk to bunk, in whispers. The English aren't what we were told. The war wasn't what we were told. He wasn't what we were told. One by one, the pillars came down. And here is the strangest part. As the hate drained out of them, something rushed in to fill the space. Not resentment. Gratitude. These boys, who had arrived certain they would be executed, began to feel something they could barely name toward the men who had captured them. The British hadn't just spared their lives, they had handed them back their humanity. But mercy came too late for so many. For every boy who was captured and saved, there were others who never got the chance. And that is the tragedy that shadows this entire story. Think of the final weeks of the war. As the Reich crumbled, the fanatics at the top did not soften. They hardened. SS squads roamed the ruins, hanging deserters from lampposts with cardboard signs strung around their necks. Any boy who tried to surrender, who tried to walk away, who simply dared to want to live, was murdered by his own side. Children were shot by German officers for the crime of not wanting to die. Killed in doorways, strung up in town squares, as a warning to the others. The very firing squad the boys feared from the enemy was aimed at them by their own commanders. And then, there were the boys who died, still believing the lie. The ones who fired their single rocket at a tank, missed, and were gone in a flash of steel, never knowing that surrender didn't mean death, that the enemy would have given them tea and bread and a future. They died for nothing, clutching a fantasy, because no one ever reached them in time to tell them the truth. That is the cost of arrogance. The cost of a regime that would rather feed its own children into the fire than admit it had lost. The British couldn't save them all. They could only save the ones who lived long enough to be captured. And when you understand that, when you picture how many small graves were dug in those last weeks, filled with boys who were told the enemy would kill them, and then killed by their own people instead, the tea in that mug means something more. It wasn't just kindness. It was a rescue. A boy pulled out of a machine that was still trying to devour him, even as it died. The war ended. But for these boys, the story didn't. Many of them stayed in Britain long after the guns went quiet, working the farms, learning the language, sitting at British tables. And here is the ending no propaganda broadcast ever predicted. Some of them never left. The enemy's children grew up on the enemy's soil. They married. They raised families. The boys who had been sent to kill the British became their neighbors, their sons-in-law, their friends. They had been handed over as weapons. They were handed back alive. And somewhere in that story is the boy from the beginning. 15 years old, standing against a wall in the spring of 1945, hands raised, eyes shut, waiting for the click of the bolt and the last sound he would ever hear. That click never came. Instead, a rough hand pressed a warm mug into his fingers, and a tired voice told him to sit down before he fell down. He had crossed an entire war expecting to be executed by monsters. And in the end, the monsters turned out to be the ones who saved him. He braced for a firing squad, and they gave him a home.